All right. Okay, I think we're broadcasting. Hello, everyone. It's funny because I just saw you all downstairs. We are having our second class. What all the people here don't know is that there's been many hours already put in the wood shop, and there's already models, small scale models of the truss, and there's already practice connections that have been made, mortise and tenon, and students are starting to work towards the white oak. They're starting to work in oak. So a lot is happening already in just this first week. So here we are today. We have the great fortune to have Dr. Lindsay Cook, who's teaching. She's a professor of art history at Ball State, and all the students get to see my cheat sheet up here. Now you know. She's an architectural historian, a translator, and a digital preservation advocate. But her real focus, well, she has lots of knowledge in lots of places, but her real focus of late is Notre Dame de Paris, and she is really going to help us dive in a little more. We got the sort of broad view on Monday, and now we're really going to, I know you have a lot of questions, so she's going to be able to answer many of these questions, I'm sure. And I'm going to turn it over to her now, since the hour goes quickly. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Tanya. And I'm really happy to be here with everyone at CUA. And I want to leave as much time as I can for questions at the end. So I'm glad to hear already that you have them. Without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and get going and give you a sense of Notre Dame of Paris through time, essentially, is the way that I'm going to talk about the building today.
I'm going to make one more quick announcement. So
go for it.
If you guys have questions, you can save them to the end, but you can also just come up here. Lindsay's going to quickly see the size of the class. So feel free to come up if you have questions during the lecture. Otherwise, you can wait till the end and you'll still have to come up. Okay?
Hi, everyone. Okay. Sounds great. So I'm assuming you can see my screen now and you can see me, and we'll just get to it. So I'm going to talk today about a few different things. I want to start by thinking about Notre Dame. I know that you've already had kind of a general overview of Gothic architecture, a bit of that. So I'm going to put Notre Dame in its historical and urban context at the beginning. We'll talk a bit about some of the buildings that inspired Notre Dame. So that would be ones that are in its kind of close network, whether ecclesiastical or geographical neighbors, and then also some that are more or farther afield that are more symbolically relevant to the history and the design of the building. We'll then spend a good amount of time focusing on thinking about Notre Dame as an iterative structure, as a building that's adaptable, and as one that looks not only to the past and to the present, but also sort of forges its own path and looks to the future as well. We'll also, if we have time, think about a few buildings that Notre Dame inspired. So it's, of course, other buildings inspired it, and it inspired other buildings. So we'll see a few of those. And then finally, if we have time, we'll talk about the fire itself and its aftermath and kind of what that means for particularly the part of the building that you're thinking about, the roof. I would say that this is something that was for a long time known mostly to specialists and those who had a real vested interest in timber, and would have made the effort to get the permissions to see that structure underneath the roof. And it's gone to, its star has risen recently once we lost it. And so this is something that I want to point out. Also is how important it always was, even if we actually couldn't see the framework underneath the roof. So to begin with a bit of this sort of urban context, it's important, while we might find ourselves in Paris today and we would go to the building and think of it as being almost timeless, as a monument that's been there forever. I think it's really important to keep in mind with this kind of structure, as old as it was, as old as it is, that there was a building there and there were buildings before the Gothic iteration of Notre Dame of Paris. And so you're seeing here in plan and also in a kind of very hypothetical model, some of the kinds of buildings that would have been on part of the cathedral group before the Gothic cathedral was constructed. And so you get the sense that it was not exactly this was always a kind of sacred site, even in pre-Roman times. This was already a sacred space, and it was adapted, transformed, and the site shifted bit by bit as time progressed. So you get a sense, especially in the plan at left, of some of the earlier structures. So for example, there was for a long time a church dedicated to the Virgin Mary or to Notre Dame, but it was a much smaller structure. So this is more or less the kind of, it would have been a smaller building. They're seeing the proposed site of that original building there, but there was also a larger basilica, and that one was previously dedicated to St. Stephen, an important patron saint of the cathedral, who also in its later iterations continued to be very relevant and important, especially to the bishops of the cathedral. And so this dedication changed. And so the building that we now know, of course, is dedicated to the Virgin Mary, Notre Dame, but it also takes up all of these other saints that were important to it too. Usually they're represented in relics, in statuary at the cathedral. All of these things, all of the elements of its history really are consolidated and continued on, even as the cathedral is radically transformed in the mid-12th century. So jumping ahead to the building at this point in these two images that you're seeing here, the building has now, the Gothic Cathedral has been constructed. And I think it's just as important to think about the cathedral. If it's not timeless, it's also shouldn't be seen in isolation. And so I'm showing you here a little bit of its context and in terms of the urban plan of the medieval city. So you can see that the cathedral was never a standalone structure. We now think of it as a great monument and that there's nothing around it. That largely has to do with 19th century urbanism that cleared the way, made a larger plaza in front of the western frontispiece. It gives us the view where we can now stand far enough back so that you can take a perfect photograph of the entire western frontispiece from the pavement to the tops of the twin towers. This is not the way that it was in the Middle Ages. There was a small plaza in front of it, in front of the cathedral, but it was much more limited. It was not as deep as it is today. And it was not a structure in isolation. There was the various members of the cathedral chapter. Those are the canons who were affiliated with the cathedral and who drew a stipend from the cathedral itself and its land holdings outside of Paris. Those, the chapter lived in this called the Cloister of the cathedral. And so they had individual houses in many cases. It was a whole sort of city within the city almost for all of those 51 members of the cathedral chapter. The bishop, of course, was extremely important too for this building. And so we have the Episcopal Palace or the Bishop's Palace, which was designed around the same time as the Gothic Cathedral itself in the 12th century, and was not dismantled until the 19th century. So this is something also that if we think about the view from the south, which is a sort of favored view that we might now have. If you're on the left bank, you can look across the Seine to the Cathedral of Paris, and it sort of unfolds before you. This is a very modern view as well, just as that complete view of the western frontispiece is a modern view, so too is that south-facing view, or that view from the south. Because when the Episcopal Palace was built up right next to it, that would have covered up really most of the lower portions of the cathedral. So it's really been opened up, isolated, and all of that has to do with 19th and 20th century urban planning. And then to zoom out just a little bit more to give you a sense of what this building, sort of where it sat within medieval Paris, I'm showing you here a historical map where you can particularly make out the wall of Philip Augustus. So King Philip Augustus, as he went off on a crusade, he begun the construction of the wall, this particular wall. It's not actually the latest medieval wall, even in the city of Paris, but it first sort of encloses the city and defines the city in a very particular way, spatially. And so the first segment of the wall on the right bank was constructed in the late 12th century, and then the rest was completed on the left bank, that is down here, in the early 13th century. And at this point, you can see, if you've ever been to Paris, you'll notice that things that you think of as being very much in the heart of Paris, like the Louvre, for example, well, right, here's the Louvre Palace right outside, actually, the definition of Paris at that time. Why I think this is important to keep in mind is that in this iteration of Paris, The Ile de la Cité is totally at the heart of that, of this state of Paris. So it's the palace on the one hand, on one side of the Cité, and Notre Dame and the rest of the Episcopal complex on the other side of this island. And so it really is totally at the core, at the heart of the city of Paris at this point around 1200. So as much as Paris has expanded, and we might now see the sort of beating heart of Paris as being centered somewhere else now, it goes back a really, really long way that the core, the heart of the city was on the Ile de la Cité. So to think about the building, the Gothic Cathedral that we're all thinking about these few weeks, just to give you a sense of this structure, it is, again, not timeless. It's not from one particular period. It's often said that the cathedral was begun in the year 1163. That has to do with a cornerstone laying, a very ceremonial event, and I think you should really take that date with a grain of salt. So certainly it would have been laid out, thought through, the design really already in the mind of the master mason long before that, foundations laid already before that. And 1163 is important from a sort of ceremonial perspective, certainly from the perspective of the church, capital C, but it's not, when it comes to architecture and construction, that's not the exact beginning of this building. So let's call it, the middle of the 12th century is when this building is getting underway. But as you can see from the dates on this slide, it also is a building that unfolds over time. And it's one where the architects are really mindful in all of these later periods, so in the 13th, the 14th, and especially the 19th century, to embed and to work within the existing framework, even as they're adapting, adjusting, and updating, in a lot of cases, stylistically updating the cathedral. The basic design is still pretty much intact from the 12th century. And that's really fascinating, I think, to keep in mind that over a 1,000-year span, the later builders can have the kind of humility, even as they're doing something really drastic and beautiful and elegant, to also be mindful of what's already there, mindful of history, and treating the stones with that much care. The interior of the building is one of the places where you can see a lot of these really dramatic shifts over time. And so we're seeing, at the same time, as an architectural historian, I look at this building as a medievalist. I look at this building and I see, if you look, for example, at the piers, we're looking at piers that were designed in the 12th century, built in the early 13th century, and yet they point also way back in time. And I'll show you exactly what I mean by that in a couple of minutes. So there's a lot of work with time there already, just from the piers themselves. The fact that they're cylindrical piers, that they look almost like columns, even if we're going to call them piers because they're a little thicker and don't adhere to sort of canonical proportions for a column. As you go up, you'll notice also an elevation that's a 3-story elevation. So this is a sort of associated with the High Gothic period around the 13th century. And yet there are details on the building, sort of archaeological remains of an earlier iteration of the elevation, suggesting that it originally had a 4-story elevation. And this points to a different time. So it's really a mishmash in that case. If you look at things like the stained glass, then you'll see that it's even been updated more recently. So elements from the 19th century, 20th century, all of these things are evident if you look really closely at the cathedral. Now, I said that in some ways, when you look at Notre Dame, you're looking really far back in time. This is certainly true. And one of the main points of reference for the Cathedral of Paris is Old St. Peter's in Rome. And this is true for a few different reasons that we might be able to say this. One is, and perhaps the most important, is the fact that it's a 5-aisled basilica. One thing that I think, particularly for your purposes, is particularly interesting too, is that while we now have a vaulted building, it does still retain, because it has this really elaborate roof framework, it does still, at the core, it retains the section also of Old St. Peter's in a way. And you can see ways that, for example, the flying buttresses are now kind of in the position where the roof was at Old St. Peter's, but there's a kind of substitution and a memory at play here. I think that's really remarkable. The fact that we have a modern building that is still pointing to the past in a lot of ways. The supports are where we see this in particular. So you can see the very slender columns that you have in St. Peter's. Of course, there's no vault here that these supports do not have to support the vault. And therefore the supports at Notre Dame of Paris and the fact that it's a multi-story elevation, these supports do have to be more reinforced, they're sturdier, and yet they still have the look of the very slender columns of Old St. Peter's. It's also a building, Notre Dame, that is in conversation with its contemporaries, so with its immediate predecessors. And here I'm showing you, this is kind of a classic image of the sort of great march of Gothic architecture as it gets taller and taller and taller until, as we know with Beauvais, where there's a collapse that gives pause to master masons. And until then, though, we do have this kind of march. Notre Dame of Paris, if you're not recognizing it right away, it's here. It's the fourth elevation that you see in this sequence. And I want to show you a couple of the ways that Notre Dame really picks up on elements that you can already see in earlier cathedrals, like Sens here, this building, which is also the Archiepiscopal See. And so Notre Dame of Paris, it was not an archbishopric. Paris was not an archbishopric, and therefore it's a sort of suffragan of Sens, which is significant. It's certainly a building that the builders were looking to. As well as Laon here in the Champagne region. I'm going to show you a couple of the ways that the buildings are related to Notre Dame. So first and foremost in plan, this is where Notre Dame picks up on Sens Cathedral in many important ways. And I think it's important, rather than thinking about particular dimensions or anything along those lines, the sort of basic geometry of the plans is very similar. The fact that you don't have a projecting transept is particularly significant and one of the things that connects the two buildings. So even though Sens is a three-aisled building and Notre Dame of Paris is a five-aisled building, you can see that the builders certainly, the builders of Paris knew of Sens, no doubt about that, and picked up on it, decided to carry some of it forward. You can see other elements really do carry on throughout the building. And one key difference, however, you'll notice an alternation of supports in Sens, right? So we have these sort of thick piers alternating with double columns. And at Paris, there is an alternating system, but it's only in the aisle. So you'll see, right, thicker piers, thinner, thicker, thinner. Whereas in the main vessel, it's really continuous. So we have pretty much identical piers all the way through. So this is one kind of way that, yes, the articulation is slightly different, and yet you can tell overall by looking at the plan that the architects are in conversation with one another through their buildings. There are also similarities with Laon, and so you can see that certainly is true of the elevation in general, and particularly of these columnar supports. So using cylindrical piers as opposed to compound piers is a notable, it's a remarkable element of Notre Dame of Paris, and it's one that it shares in common with Laon, this important cathedral in the Champagne region. As much as Notre Dame looks to the past and it is in conversation with its contemporaries, the Gothic cathedral also looked to the future, or it forged its own path. And one of the main ways that it does this is through its structure. So by lightening up its supports inside, it needs to compensate for that in some way. The way that it did that, as far as we know, was to have flying buttresses set out from the very beginning of, in that mid-12th century building. Already flying buttresses were planned. There continues to be a little bit of debate about the exact appearance of those flying buttresses, but it seems, the evidence does seem to suggest that those flying buttresses were these single reach flying buttresses like the ones that you see here. Now, there's some question about this, however, and I should explain why that is. So most of the flying buttresses were rebuilt in the 13th century, even though there had been earlier flyers before that. And then they were rebuilt yet again in the 19th century. So when we look at these buttresses, we actually have to do a lot more archaeological work. I can talk a bit about that what kind of analysis needs to be done in order to figure this out. But you can't simply look at the existing fabric of the building, even though it seems likely that these single reach flying buttresses are the original partie for this particular building. It was long thought that the first flying buttresses were actually on the nave of Notre Dame, so a later part of the building. And so it was scholars later on, including my doctoral advisor, Stephen Murray, and my undergraduate mentor, Andrew Tallon, who really, I think, have persuasively argued that there have been single reach flying buttresses as long as the building has been around, even if it's not these particular stones that you see there today. One of the ways I mentioned, I can tell you, so one of the ways that you can analyze a building to understand these kinds of questions and to try to get to the bottom of them is through laser scanning. And that's actually why some of these laser scans were made. Obviously, there are reasons, other reasons to do so. So for example, there was a laser scan of the roof made. I hope you've all seen that. There are renderings made from that laser survey that are available. That was made in order to assess the state of the roof in 2014 by one of the architects associated with the cathedral, Remy Fromont. And so that's one reason that you could want a laser scan. Another reason would be to detect essentially deformation or movement in the building over time. In a building that isn't properly supported, that is one that wouldn't have had flying buttresses at the beginning, you would expect to see some deformation in the vaults. And so part of the reason that my mentor, Andrew Tallon, had made his laser scan had to do with looking for that kind of deformation. Seeing none, the logical conclusion there was that there had been buttresses all along, right from the beginning, right from the outset. There are other reasons or other uses that these scans also can be put to. So you're seeing here a composite model that has recently been put together by the CNRS in Paris. This is a sort of major scientific research center in Paris. And what they've done is essentially collected all of the photogrammetric and laser data that exists in the world as far as they know, and they've stitched it together. So you now have this composite model, which therefore has it's as dense as possible at every point. So that means that the roof, in the case where there was a laser survey made of the roof, that is then put together with a more general survey that was made by Andrew Tallon, and other smaller sort of fragments are then stitched together to make this composite model. Sort of pulling away from there, though, I'm pulling back to Andrew Tallon's 2010 scan, because I want to point out sort of some of the uses it's already served and where you'll be able to see it. So for example, one of the main reasons he wanted to make this scan was to create an accurate plan of the building. So it might be surprising to know this, but a lot of the times medievalists are using really outdated plans when they're thinking about the buildings they study. And so part of the goal of having a laser scan, or one of the benefits of a laser scan, is that you can then take various slices from it, as you probably all know, in order to create a rendering that's much more accurate than some of the hand-drawn plans that were made in the past. And so the result is this, and you can find this plan in the book that I translated, Notre Dame Cathedral, 9 Centuries of History, which I hope you've all seen. And I just want to, while we're sitting here looking at this, I'd like to talk through a bit of how this the building unfolded, because it's clearest in the plan. So it was a building essentially built from east to west, so from the chevet that we're seeing over here to the west end of the building, the towers here. At the point where it was essentially complete, so it's the construction moved from east to west, reached the west towers, they were completed. We know that there were bells in the towers by 1245, so that tells you between around 1160 and 1245, there's this sweep from east to west. At the point where the building is, for all intents and purposes, complete, there's then a decision to continue to transform the building and to continue to add on to it. a lot of those transformations had to do with liturgical demands on the building. So things like desiring chantry chapels, for example, to say masses for the dead. That's one good reason why adjustments and transformations were made later. So if you go into the Notre Dame of Paris today, you would enter the building. Right over here is where you enter the building. And right from the beginning, you can turn right and you'll see chapels all along the aisles of the nave. None of those were there in the initial iteration of the building. So this is one way where space that was once outside essentially is appropriated. It's made part of the building. So walls are put up, walls are torn down, new vaults are put up, and you have a chapel. So this is the kind of transformation, kind of stitching in, adapting the building as need demanded. That was a 13th century transformation. Another one that we're going to see is the addition of or new transept facades were also designed in the mid 13th century. So beginning with the north transept facade, this one was added on, and then the south transept facade. What's notable about these, in addition to their elegant architecture, rayonnant architecture, is that we know the names of the master masons associated with those two campaigns. You don't need to remember them necessarily, but the Jean de Chelles was the master mason of the north transept facade, and Pierre de Montreuil was the master mason of the south transept facade. This is, as we would expect, by the 13th century, you start to see more and more names associated with individual buildings, and we have more of a sense of this. So this isn't necessarily exceptional, but it's important to know that by then, the kind of individual architect is starting to come into his own, even if that word architect is defined in a different way than it would go on to be defined in later centuries. The following century saw new additions. So the green parts that you see on this plan are where we find new additions in the 14th century. And they might seem relatively superficial, and yet they really transform the look of the building. So if you're seeing the building from the east end, for example, almost everything you see that in terms of tracery, a lot of that is 14th century work. And part of the reason I think it's hard to pick it out at first or notice that it's different is because it really does pick up on especially the 13th century work from the building, but even fits in pretty naturally with the 12th century chevet, which is just a fancy word for the east end of the building. So this is where you'll find the plan is in this book, and it's available in both French and English now. To give you a sense, I've already sort of talked a bit about kind of how the building unfolded, but even before there was anything built, there had to be an idea, there had to be a design. And this often came down to simple geometric forms that could be translated, could be set out in a relatively straightforward manner. And in this particular case, the geometry of Notre Dame seems to be a series of essentially concentric circles that make up the geometry of the chevet or the east end. And we know also from looking at a section of the cathedral that it was designed around a triangle. So some buildings are designed around a rectangle, and some are designed around a triangle. So we know from especially in this beautiful rendering from the laser survey, you get a sense, it's quite clear that if you that it's an equilateral triangle. In the end, though, from those ideas, you have to actually set out the building. And so that's what we're going to talk through for a little bit now, to see these various iterations of the cathedral as they're put up. So I mentioned that the building started in the middle of the 12th century, and by the year 1177, so that's in the upper right corner, you can see the hypothetical reconstruction of this state of the building. You see that the chevet is essentially set out. It's essentially constructed by that point. One thing that's really notable, especially for your purposes, is the fact that the roof would have been constructed before the stone vaults down below. And this makes a certain amount of sense, right? You're going to keep the weather out already if you build the roof first. You have a sense that this is going to be structurally sound and really held up as you then construct the vaults. And so you're seeing here the degree to which timber is important as a construction material in this building, in addition to being used in the roof. So over time, gradually, I'd say the sort of share of timber in any given building had actually diminished over time. There used to be more timber, relatively speaking, in earlier medieval buildings. But here, once it's really pretty much limited to the roof structure, you do see the ways that it's still really important as a construction material. So used as braces and struts and supports, and also notably for the actual formwork around which the vaults will be built. So you can see here is a reconstruction of exactly that kind of formwork, centering, where you would then lay the arches on the centering, fill in the webbing, and at some point someone has to be the brave person who removes the centering, right, and hopes that the vault doesn't fall on their head. And so you see that this is the state. We know that this is the way it was done, thanks to a document that survives actually from this time period. So that's why we have a very particular, very precise looking date of 1177. That's when we have the report of a monk who tells us that from another associated with another building, not with Notre Dame, who tells us that the building was built basically except for the vaults. And so that's why we have a sense of the way that it was constructed. By 1182 rather, you can see that there's also a provisional wall added. And you can imagine why this would be, right? This is an active cathedral with a large clergy, and they had stuff to do, right? So this is a way for the liturgy to continue, particularly once the choir, and you can imagine choir stalls as well, were installed in the east end of the building. Then construction could continue on the crossing, the transept, and eventually the nave after that. You'll notice, probably you've already seen this, but I mentioned that there was a change from a 4-story elevation to a 3-story elevation. And so you're seeing here one possibility of what that 4-story elevation might have looked like. And so we have a triforium here. This, all a triforium is it looks out onto the roof behind it. In this case, they're in the shape of oculi. And you'll notice too that as far as we know, based on some trace elements that survive, it seems that these took the form of crosses. This would have been really significant because the cathedral had recently received a relic of the True Cross. And so it seems to be a way of amplifying that relic through the architecture itself. Is a really remarkable gesture to kind of monumentalize this very tiny little piece of wood that they would have held in the treasury in stone, making it monumental so that anyone who comes and sees the choir would have a sense of this projection of kind of the church triumphant. You're seeing here the progression in the 13th and 14th centuries. So I mentioned that this is where you have radical transformations, even as the building really is carrying forward what the original master mason had in mind, those basic geometric shapes that they had in mind for the overall structure. Those continue to be laid out, and yet the articulation, the details really do change over this 200-year period. So we see the building continues to move forward toward the west, and as we see in the reconstruction from around 1208. And by, as I said, 1245, at that point you have the addition of these nave chapels I was mentioning. You have the towers completed all the way, including the addition of bells in the towers. That's the function of the towers, is to basically tell time for the city, for the liturgy that took place inside and outside of the building. So it's kind of the sacred and secular time at the same time is marked by the bells of Notre Dame. And you'll also notice this first great rose window on the west front as well. Another I'm not going to delve into this too much, but you'll also notice that there's a lot of sculptural, figural sculpture that has also found its way onto the building at this point. And it's important to note in that reconstruction from around 1245 that all of this would have been painted, really richly painted. It was a colorful gallery of kings that you had here, a succession of kings that looked very much like French kings, although there was some idea that these were actually supposed to represent Old Testament kings. This came into play after the French Revolution, where it was very much debated as to whether these seemed to be symbols of the monarchy and were taken down at that point for that reason, even though it's perfectly possible that in the 13th century, that's not actually what they represented. They weren't secular kings, but were rather ancestors, essentially, of Christ. So you see the monumental sculpture has now been in place, the bells are in place. Again, we think the building is complete, and yet it's not. So around 1300, you see bit by bit, this is the transept facade I was telling you about earlier, designed by Jean de Chelles, with an elaborate rayonnant rose window. And then one that matches it was then added on the south side of the building by Pierre de Montreuil. At this point, you might notice, I would say here is where it's most obvious maybe, where you have a sort of more austere, bare looking structure to the extreme east, and one that's more ornamented, ornate on to the west. And so there is some sense that, well, once we've gone this far, right, there is still the possibility to continue adorning the building and to create a belt of chapels around here. And that's exactly what they do. And if anything, it becomes even more ornate as you sort of wrap around the east end. Oops. Then finally, I just wanted to point out before we move on, there's also interior structures, liturgical elements, things like the jubé. This is a choir screen that would have really limited any layperson's visual access to the choir. And yet it's also covered with figural sculpture and narrative scenes. And so there's a way that even as much as you're an average person is kind of denied entry to this space, unless you're a clergy member or another sort of invited dignitary, you wouldn't have access to the choir, that space, the sanctuary inside the choir screen. But you would have visual access to the stories that are being told on the outside through the sculpture on the outside of the choir screen. So it's a complex, it's a kind of a contradiction there, it would seem. There are ways that the building also, this is another kind of transition or transformation that you'll notice in the cathedral, ways that the building marks out the most important or most sacred spaces in the building. And so this is one of those ways. So you can see the pier sections on left and right. And the ones at left, that's to the east, where the sanctuary is, where the choir is, certainly the most sacred part of the building, versus the kind of the blockier pilasters that you see in the pier sections at right. So there's a real shift here. It seems subtle at first, but then when you notice it, then you see it. And this is really true on many levels. You'll see gables, for example, proliferate at the east end that you don't see as much on the west end. A sense of kind of progression as you move through the building. There's a kind of ramping up of sanctity that you find as you move through the building. I mentioned earlier, I was talking about the 4-story elevation and the triforium and clerestory that you had in the 12th century iteration of the building. This is one case where the actual fabric of the building still retains a trace of that earlier iteration. So if you'll look, this is the way the building looks now, more or less, I mean, with the exception of the roof, right? But you'll notice here, right, we have these clerestory windows. This looks like tracery from around the year 1220. You might think of another cathedral like Reims Cathedral has similar bar tracery, kind of like this. And yet, if you look at the window frame, what you'll notice are these thin colonnettes and they just sort of stop. This isn't common, right? We wouldn't expect this to be the treatment around elegant bar tracery of the 1220s. And so this led archaeologists to realize really already in the 19th century that there had been a different kind of window here initially. So this was the base of the original clerestory, right? So you can imagine, why did they do this? Well, on the one hand, you of course have the question of keeping up with the stylistic developments of the period. That's certainly something that happens frequently at Notre Dame. On the other hand, it's also to make the building brighter. There's no question about that. And it also goes along with a structural change to the building. So you'll see the old lean-to roof. That was why you needed this sort of blind triforium here. And once the roof is changed to become this really sort of flat parapet, that's when you're able to extend down the clerestory window there. So this is a transformation that is at once, related to a structural change to the building and is also a stylistic one at the same time. I'm just showing you a detail of another 13th century transformation. So I mentioned the transept facades by Jean de Chelles and Pierre de Montreuil. So I'm showing you here the kind of pre and post restoration view of the south transept facade. And you can notice really, I hope you'll see that there are some differences, right, between the left and right. So what you're seeing at left is a photograph taken before the 19th century restoration, this major project by Jean-Baptiste Lassus and Viollet-le-Duc. And you'll notice, frankly, that it's less frilly. That's one way to say it, right? So you'll notice that there's all these little kind of climbing crockets and a finial at the top. You don't have any of that over here, right? So there's a lot of additions that are made in the 19th century that are they're out of whole cloth. These are not elements that had been part of the building before. It's inventions of the 19th century. You'll also notice the tracery itself of this great rose window by Pierre de Montreuil. You'll notice here that the petals, right, the top, it's very elegant, right? That the top, the cardinal points are actually the ends of the petals. Whereas here, what Viollet-le-Duc and Lassus have done, it was for a structural reason. There was kind of a good reason for doing this. They dismantled the entire rose window and they put it back up, basically reinforcing it by rotating where they replaced the tracery. So you now see it's essentially looks like a cross now, right? Where we have these bars at the cardinal points. So a seemingly subtle shift, and yet a part of the way that the 19th century kind of inscribes itself within the history of this building, even if you're kind of unwitting and don't notice. And the tracery does look, 13th century still. So you wouldn't necessarily know about this intervention unless you have this kind of side-by-side view. The other side of the same window, I just wanted to give you a sense of what it looks like inside. And some of the sculpture from the building. So most of the 13th century sculpture, some of it survives on the western frontispiece, on the portals of the north and south transept arms, and some of it is now in a museum. So a lot you'll find in the Musée de Cluny, including the Gallery of Kings, the fragments that survive of that after they were dismantled after the French Revolution. You'll also find this elegant figural representation of Adam that once was on that same transept facade. It's part of this whole ensemble. I think I'll close by just pointing to a few buildings that Notre Dame inspired. And so it really, it caused a splash. It was a very important building. There are other cathedrals around that were made a little bit later that you could say were even more influential potentially, or inspired more Gothic architecture of later periods. But Notre Dame did have a kind of its particular place. In terms of its massing or its overall look, much in the same way that we could say that Sens, its plan inspired Notre Dame of Paris, the massing of Notre Dame of Paris then inspired cathedrals like Bourges in particular. And so you see that kind of step down, almost layer cake quality. And what that is you're noticing that the section, it too, it's designed around a triangle, an equilateral triangle. So in one way, it's this one building looking to another. In another sense, it's also shared geometry that the two have in common that is then realized over time and really brought to life, set out with individual hands. There are also cases where a very monumental central building inspired smaller parish and pilgrimage churches. The particular building you're seeing at left is one of my particular areas of expertise. In fact, it's a pilgrimage and parish church near the forest of Fontainebleau. And it was institutionally affiliated with Notre Dame of Paris. And as you can see, I hope it's really clear that really at various moments in time, so in the 12th century, in the 13th century, in the 14th century, Saint-Mathurin of l'Archamp, the building you're seeing at left, looked back, it kept looking to Notre Dame of Paris. This was not just a one-off moment. It, as the Cathedral of Paris changed and transformed, so too did this parish and pilgrimage church change and transform in a lot of cases, really parallel ways. By far, the most inspirational part of Notre Dame of Paris were its twin towers. And so you're seeing them here. The master mason of Troyes Cathedral at a certain point in the 15th century specifically says that we need to go and look at a few other cathedrals, and one of them is Paris, in order to design our own towers. And so you can see some trace of that. The tower actually wasn't built until a later period, but you can tell that there's still inspiration being taken from Notre Dame of Paris, in the sense that it's a square plan tower, and it also has a flat top. So this is a way that it differs from, let's say, a building like Salisbury, where you would, its central spire, for example. It doesn't have a spire at the top. It doesn't taper in any particular way. It's a flat-topped tower. Bourges, again, we saw that in its massing picked up on Notre Dame of Paris, and for its tower too. We have a sense that in the 1520s, Bourges Cathedral also sent people to Paris to look and get a kind of expertise in Paris to be able to create a tower that emulated the towers of Paris. And you can see by the 17th century, I would say this is when you have really the crystallization of what I call the image of Notre Dame. And so if you look at all of these graphic representations of the cathedral, even when it appears in the far, far background, you have a boiling down of what people who live and artists living in Paris saw of Notre Dame when they looked at it. And I would say the recurring theme in all of these, sometimes you get a detailed view, but that's actually very rare to have any of the sculpture represented, for example, anything like that. What it usually boils down to are the twin towers of the Western frontispiece, the spire that was added in the 13th century, and the roof. And this is, I think, where you come in. This is something that, even though you couldn't see the roof when you first walked into the building, even though it's not been the most visible part of the building in terms of its nuts and bolts, it produces the view of Notre Dame, the image of Notre Dame that most people for centuries have had in their mind when they think of this building. So it becomes the kind of icon of Notre Dame. And I think this is part of why it's so important to get to know it in a really deep way in order to be able to bring it back to life, because it's a really important and essential part of the building. The spire that you see here, so you can see that in a 17th century print, as well as in a watercolor by Le Corbusier from the 20th century. What I love about this is the two artists who were inspired by Notre Dame in these cases. I think you can see there are parallels between these two images, of course. But what strikes me is the fact that they were looking at two different spires. So the spire had been dismantled in the 18th century, and it was then rebuilt in the 19th century by the restorers Viollet-le-Duc and Lassus. And so even though Le Corbusier was looking at a sort of larger, grander spire when he made his watercolor, it strikes me that even so, artists across centuries were still struck by that same sort of overall silhouette. It was not in its details that these artists were struck by it. It was more the kind of overall view, the silhouette that the building had. So you're seeing here again, pre-restoration, and then at the conclusion, essentially, of the restoration campaign of the 19th century. I think I will stop here so that we have time for questions, but I'm happy also to go back to anything I've seen or forge ahead and talk about other things that I still have in my slide deck. So let's stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you. Wow, I have a lot of questions, but I'm students digest a little bit and come up. I'm sure you have some questions, so I'm going to hold space until you guys get up here. But I do have one question to ask about thinking about how we inscribe, or how we kind of mark our time in these changes. Well, first, I love that now I have some ideas of pre-Viollet-le-Duc and post-Viollet-le-Duc details, so I feel like totally empowered. So thank you very much for that. But how do you think we will inscribe changes or make change? How do you think our time will be imprinted on Notre Dame in future?
So one of the ways that I'm already, I love this question, and I'm obsessed with time, as you can imagine. And so I've been thinking about this a lot. I would say the main way that I see that it's at this point going to happen in the restoration project is particularly with the roof. So it sounds to me like, and you'll get to the bottom of this too as this project unfolds, I'm sure, but it sounds to me like the plan is most likely to take a truss, maybe two trusses, and use those as kind of, they see those as being the most perfect of all, almost. So it's as if the architects of today have gone through and noticed, oh, okay, they were figuring out what they were doing as they worked out the various trusses. And so the idea that we keep hearing, right, about two particular trusses really fascinates me. The fact that it's being kind of distilled, and we have it's our own, we're having our own Viollet-le-Duc moment, is what I would say, because he too had ideas about what was the most perfect moment of Gothic architecture. That's why whenever he found something that was a little bit later, a little too pointy or something, he would round it out, make it more geometric. So I think the idea that we might end up with a roof that is not an exact replica of the original, but instead is repeating particular trusses that are seen as the best for whatever reason. I want to get to the bottom of why have we decided that, and what was, let's say, deficient about some of the others. And that is going to be one major way, even if it's invisible to most people that ever visit. I think that's an important way that scholars, at least in the future, will think about inscribing our own time on the building today. I think also we're at a point where the building was damaged really badly. And I think for the first couple of years, I think I was so relieved that it had survived at all that I failed to really grapple with that. And I think as you see, as films are coming out where you see details of the extent of the damage, as more and more photography is emerging, you get a sense for the fact that this is going to be really, a lot of extreme decisions are going to have to be made about even vaults that are technically still intact. Some of them are going to have to be partially dismantled in order to replace them if stone is deemed not to be structurally sound or not going to last. And so I guess it's going to be in that kind of patchwork that's going to emerge is also going to be another way that we inscribe our own time. I think one way that we haven't really thought about yet, but we might inscribe our own time, is really thinking critically about Viollet-le-Duc and all his complexities, and even some of the more unsavory aspects of his beliefs and his ideology at the time, and particularly how that emerged in the 19th century sculpture. So in the form of the pseudo-gargoyles in particular. And so I've started to think about ways, I think that needs to be addressed, particularly when it comes to things like essentially caricatures of racial groups or of ethnic groups, and the way that should be addressed at the very least in the interpretation of the monument. So that's one way that I think, in a positive light, that we could actually have an effect on the way that we see the building in the future, a way of thinking of it differently. I'm sure there are 100 other ways that our time will be inscribed that we're not even thinking of now. I also think what we do with the traces of the building, so the vestiges of the building, there's just so much material. I think what we do with that is also going to tell us something. Is there going to be a museum that's basically the, the charred version of the remains of Notre Dame. How much of that is really going to be saved, and how are we going to interpret that as well, is another way that will it might be something that would never have happened in another age, and very much will happen today.
That's super interesting. Sort of like we may leave a trace of sort of safety, fire safety.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully some kind of reparations in the sort of cultural arena, as opposed to style and culture,
Mm-hmm.
style and structure. Anyways, I'm going to let, there's a line starting, so.
Great, okay.
Hello, my question has to do with the original context.
Mm-hmm.
So how or was the original composition of Notre Dame kind of an expression of like a medieval Christian understanding of the world? Like how did it fit in then to that realm of thinking?
Can you say that another way, or maybe just repeat your question?
Yeah, so how was or is Notre Dame an expression of kind of medieval Christian thought at the time, or their understanding of the world?
So I think this comes through in a lot of ways. The place where it's the easiest to tell, I think, is in the plan. I mean, so the very fact that we have a really clear cross inscribed, and nowhere is this clearer than in the laser scan, I think, of that, the plan that's produced from the laser scan, right? That kind of glowing image of the glowing cross. There's no other way to see it than in those terms. There's also, it changes over time though. So I think the best way, the place where it's really clearest, first of all, comes in the plan, comes in its geometry, comes in its connections to early Christian basilicas like St. Peter's. So I think it's particularly relevant. The fact it's not just a fluke, right, that it's a 5-aisled basilica. That's one way that it's trying to connect itself with the early Christian past. There are also more explicit ways that it refers to biblical stories and to an understanding of Christianity, largely through the figural sculpture. And I would say, when you're talking about architecture, sometimes it's easy to get carried away with, if there are cases of seeing 3s and 7s and this kind of numerology, that's often where people get carried away, right? But I think that there are so many other more explicit references to biblical stories, having a sense of the local saints that are particularly relevant to Paris, are also joined together with more universal saints and the apostles through the figural sculpture. So there's a way of kind of joining all of those things together. And then I would also say that all of these things are brought together and actually sort of made to come alive through the liturgy. So, I mean, it's impossible to think about this building without thinking about the liturgy. And so things like even the stone vaults and the way that they would have made the chant and song resonate in the building, all of that is part of that's built into the design on purpose. And it already had to do with knowing that the building would be brought to life through music largely. So that I think that's another important piece of the puzzle for sure. It's everywhere, I guess, is the answer. It's just such a big question. And also, as I mentioned before too, it's in the form of the bells as well. So the fact that you have the kind of structuring of liturgical time, which also then you can imagine you can't escape the sound of that, even if you've forgotten to come to church recently, those kinds of things, right? It's a way of the building also kind of calling out to you. It's a way for the cathedral actually to have a voice almost in the city.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you for the lecture. That was great. My question is looking at like some of the finer details that you talked about, like at the transept, some of the more elaborate piers, and then like them in between the buttresses building little side chapels. Like, do we have an idea of when those decisions were made, if that was ever like seen in the beginning design stages, or if that was kind of made during different stages of the process?
It's a really good question. So I think particularly for the difference between the Eastern crossing piers and the Western crossing piers, I think that's an open question, because it's now very easy to see this. I think overall, some things like gables, for example, existing on the east end and not on the west end. I think that's significant. I think the fact is that a gable sort of referred to this, it's a passageway, it's a gateway, and it seemed to sort of symbolize a passage to heaven. It's why you see it very often sort of surrounding tomb effigies around the same time. So I would say that in that case, it's symbolic and therefore would have been kind of worked out on purpose. I think the case of the crossing piers that's an open question. It's true that we read it that way today as being, from sort of the more austere to the more elaborate, the more sacred, but it's also a lapse in time, right? So what happens between the Eastern crossing piers and the Western crossing piers coming up is they basically designed the transept facades. We don't know what those looked like. I mean, we don't have traces of them. And I think it's because we know how much time and how much energy went into designing the 13th century transept facades, you better believe that that's a period when they're having all kinds of new ideas. So I do think it still remains possible that it's more a change of, it's a change of plan. But it doesn't mean that we don't also read it and it wouldn't have been read in the way that we now see it as a more symbolic, having a more symbolic function too. In terms of the chapels, I should just say also, so the chapels we know based on this, it's kind of a liturgical question, I guess, is the short answer. So things like chapels, while there was exactly the space set out for them, right? So the space between the buttresses is where they designed those chapels. They just fill them in. There wasn't, at the time when the building was first set out, the kind of chantry chapels essentially become, and having private masses sung for the dead, that really becomes, that's instituted later. And so that's part of, and it really happens at Notre Dame. There's a wonderful article that explains exactly this, and that conceptions of purgatory that are emerging in the 13th century, those really get intertwined with this desire to have space in the cathedral and to find space into the cathedral, bring space inside in order to then set up and have chapels for the chaplains that are being funded by all kinds of wealthy people to be said in the cathedral. So I think that's the driver there. Whereas it's also, in the case of the crossing piers, it's a slightly different question, and that's a more architectural one, pure and simple.
Great, thank you.
Of course.
Hello. Okay, so if there's no more questions, one of the awesome things about this is our students are welcome to ask. I'm getting Lindsay more questions later, so we're now sort of where I see us as a team, and so anymore we'll feed you with the things we make and let you know what we're making and show you, give you updates, and maybe when there's questions along the way, we'll reach out. So.
Fantastic. I'm so excited to see what you come up with. This is such an exciting project, and I'm really excited to collaborate with you all.
Yes, thank you. All right. I guess you just say goodbye these days, right? Online.
That's right.
Okay.
Take care.